back to The Art of Parenting. This is your host, Jeanne-Marie Penel. And today I have Jodi Pawluski with us, who is actually tuning in from France, which I just got discovered, which is wonderful. I'm in San Diego. And Jodi, thank you so much for making the time to be here. I know it's been a long time coming. And we're going to be talking all things mommy brain, if I'm correct in your research and so forth. So again, thank you for making the time to be here and welcome to The Art of Parenting.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And
Yes.
I'm very much looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah. So as I always like to get us started is I love to have my guest define what the art of parenting means to them.
Yeah, this is a good question. In fact, I was just mentioned to my husband last night that I was going to go on a podcast called The Art of Parenting, and he's like, "There's an art to this."
Oh, yes.
And kind of in a joking way, but yeah. So how would I define the art of parenting? Ooh, this is a good question. I'm a parent myself of two kids. I think for me, when I think about parenting, I think one thing is to acknowledge that there's a lot of diversity in what is quote unquote good parenting. Right. And I think we forget that there isn't one way to do it. There's a lot of really good and great ways to do it. So for me, the art of parenting is accepting the diversity and working to find what works for you and your child within your household. So what works for somebody else in their household, that's great for them, but in your household, that might not work for you at all. So remembering there's many different great ways to do it, and you have to find what works for you, which can be
Beautiful.
challenging, but this is how I'd like to think about the
Right,
art of
right.
parenting.
Yeah, no, and it's true, and you say you have two children. I'm sure that they're very different from each other, right? You're the same parent, but and yes, we're the same parent, but I feel that we evolve also as human being, we don't parent the second one the same way we did the first one and so on. So yes, it is an art. Beautiful. Thank you for that, Jodi. And before we get started, I would love if you could take the time to introduce yourself and give us a little bit of your background and how you came to do the work that you're doing today.
Yeah. So I'm a neuroscientist. I have actually a Bachelor of Science in biopsychology, a master's in psychology, and a PhD in neuroscience. And then a few years ago, I did additional training to work as a psychotherapist. But my focus as a researcher in neuroscience, and even when I was in graduate school, was really investigating, or I was very curious about the intersection between hormones, brain, and behavior, specifically with the transition to motherhood. And so this really became my interest and passion early on to do research in this area, and also research in this area with regards to perinatal mental illness. And so what happens to our brains with perinatal mental illness, what happens when we're taking medications during pregnancy to, a mother's brain and that of her offspring. And I've done a lot of behavioral neuroscience research in that domain, as well as looking at, I really started looking at trying to understand what happens in terms of memory in mothers and first and second time mothers in animal models. So I'll say that I use often laboratory rodents in my research, because we can deep dive into different behaviors and brain mechanisms. So I started off being really interested in understanding what happens in terms of memory, hormone changes across parenthood, and is that different in the first time mom compared to a second time mom in my animal models, and looking at different characteristics of neuroplasticity, so how cells are changing or neurons are changing in moms' brains during this time. So that's kind of where I started, and I've really been, continually interested in how the brain changes in parents with health and with illness, because I think we need to learn so much more about both of those things when it comes to neurobiology in
Yeah.
particular.
Yeah, definitely. And it seems like it's such a science that is just like there's still so much to learn and so much to discover, right? It's like the universe, the galaxy in there, right? We don't know.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. And so you say that you work, with lab animals, but have you followed women as well, like
I've
actually
also done
human
some work.
mothers and kind
Yeah,
of
yeah,
done
yeah. So
research with them? Hmm.
yeah, I've done some research in human mothers, primarily in collaboration with my former postdoctoral supervisor, Dr. Tim
Okay. Okay.
Oberlander, at BC Women and Children's Hospital. So I've done some work looking at differences in hormone profiles and biomarkers of brain function in moms that have struggled with mental health challenges across pregnancy and postpartum, and also whether or not they've been taking an antidepressant medication. So I've done some of this work, a few studies with over the years in women in particular, and then I've been involved in other projects in women looking at memory during pregnancy, and how that can change if you're pregnant or not pregnant, and factors like this. So periodically over the years, I have been doing human work in human participants. Yeah, it depends on the question being asked. And then I work with clients now,
Okay.
part time. And so this also gives a different perspective, of course, and really gives a different understanding of what it's like to be challenged with motherhood and parenthood, right? Because we often read about, you know, what are the struggles, but when you actually talk to individuals, they can often, you realize the reality of the struggles, or the multifaceted and multidimensional aspects that play into how we're feeling. So this has been very valuable to have both the science, but also the one-on-one experience with individuals.
Right, right,
Yeah.
right. And like you said at the beginning, it's different for everyone. So it's going to be interesting to follow and speak to these mothers. What with your research and talking to these mothers and such, what is for you the predominant struggle that you see affecting motherhood for many? Is there like one or two that you kind of reoccurring that you're seeing or not?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I often, with colleagues and other researchers and psychiatrists that I work with and stuff, these topics come up. What are reoccurring themes? And so this can depend on different factors as well. It can depend on maybe the age of the individual or the demographic where the clinic is situated. And I think there's lots of factors. For me, as I've learned more about motherhood and taken a step back to understand the social pressures, or the
Mm,
environmental factors that are playing a role in parenthood, but specifically in those who identify as mothers, because I think motherhood itself has a special list of pressures and to-dos
yes.
that's quite
Hmm.
different than fatherhood, for example, although fathers, of course, have different kind of social pressures. So when I've zoomed out a bit more over the past few years from just like what's going on in the brain, and hormones and things like that, to actually what's going on that's contributing to this, because it's not all biology, of course, it's an
Right, right.
interplay between biology and environmental factors. And then I start to, recently we wrote a review about this, that there's components. It's different for different individuals, but some key components or themes can be, intensive mothering ideologies or specific
Huh,
parenting ideologies.
huh.
These are
Yes.
ideas I'm throwing out there.
Right, right,
So you
right.
can look at the individual, the family, you can go out to institutional issues, you can go out to societal issues and so forth, right? So I think we can look at each layer. One would be, what do you feel is important for you? What is society telling you as a mother, let's say, of what to do? What's the current, theme of how
Trend
to
or
do
right,
stuff?
right.
Then
Hmm.
there's always the relational component. If you're a single parent, that adds a different dimension than if you're partnered, and then how involved and supportive your partner is adds another dimension. Then you have the family expectations. Some people in different cultures or environments are, we're supposed to have at least 3 kids, right? Or, there's all different kind of components. So I think, and then you can go out to, is childcare available? What about financial support? What about healthcare coverage? And then you can keep going,
Right,
there's
right.
religious expectations for some and things. So I think for me, there's not like, I wouldn't say there's one theme, except for the theme of the need to perhaps define what it is to be a mother and a parent. I think this is the theme, and accepting the diversity that makes up parenthood, essentially. And I think that, society doesn't do a great job of supporting females, mothers, and children. And so I think there's much that can be done in different areas. Yeah.
So when you're saying define what motherhood is, that sounds like it's work to be done maybe even before conception, right? To be, or those during those 9 months, to really be tuning in to what motherhood is to us and what it looks like to us. But I can see where that could get into also little problematics, maybe if we didn't have a good relationship with our own mother, or if we're comparing to, all our elders, our sisters, our girlfriends, whatever. So it's really, I mean, it sounds like it's difficult in a way to tune out all those factors that you were mentioning and really tune in to say, okay, what do I want motherhood to look like for me?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I mean, is that,
Yes. And I think
yeah,
that's the thing, is sometimes and this is also, I should say, it's something that fathers will struggle with as
yes.
well,
Oh, definitely.
right? And
Yes,
so,
yes.
mothers typically become, and birthing mothers typically become, the primary caregivers. So there's an extra mental load there often. But, there's a struggle when we transition to parenthood, I think, to just kind of redefine our roles. And society often is setting us up with specific gender roles that
Right, right.
often don't do anyone a great service. And
Okay.
so I think, it would be ideal, of course, to be able to, before you have a child, come up with kind of a better, clearer idea of who's doing what and how this might look, and who will support me, and where can I go for extra, support and healthcare and what have you. I think would be, an ideal
Ideal. Yeah,
situation.
yeah, yeah.
But also in these cases, you might quickly realize how little support there is for how you would like to do
Right,
things,
right,
right?
right.
But definitely having a conversation with, if you have a partner as you go into parenthood, about these things is really helpful. And there are guides and discussion questions that are, you can find on Postpartum Support International about what to do for the postpartum, who's going to do what's that going to look like. There are resources for discussion about these things.
Yeah,
But I think beyond that, acknowledging that there's a lot of different factors at play, particularly for the primary caregiver, that can really influence how much they, are able to do in the postpartum. But I also think about it as how much their brain can do,
right,
right?
right,
So,
right.
and it's often the mothers that we will be hearing them talk about their brains not working really well, or, their brain is mushy and things like this. And I think that this is also part and parcel to this kind of mental load, where there's this cognitive labor, there's emotional labor. We can also add in the physical labor of parenting, because we know often all of those factors, particularly in different sex couples, fall on the mother. And so this is where, I'd love to see more research on the neurobiology of parenthood and motherhood, taking into account more of these different factors that play a role, not just, say, parenting stress, or not just poverty, but looking at the intersection between them, as well as parenting ideology, relationship satisfaction, and what have you, because I think there's many components there. And your
Definitely.
brain can only do so much.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is the thing.
Yeah. No, and I asked that to kind of, selfishly because I'm a birth doula, and that's kind of a recent, you know, job or passion that I'm doing. And I have found I really like to have that conversation with, if there are two people involved with a partner, to really be letting them kind of think and ask questions and all of that, way before the due date, so that we're first of all, like you say, we're planning for the postpartum period. Like, I really want to emphasize that women need to recuperate, and that they've gone through a big physical change, and you're going to talk more about the hormones and all that. Like, we're going through a lot, and so we need that rest time afterwards, where unfortunately today we're like, we bounce right back and we're back to ourselves. And it's like, no, that's not realistic. And it's disrespectful to the human body. And it's just, it's just, so yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and that's another one of those factors that can
exactly.
contribute to the overload. It's like, but I'm supposed to fit into my skinny jeans or whatever. Like, there's so many
Mm,
different factors I think we need to really acknowledge that put pressure on mothers and parents in general to be a certain way when it's not really biologically how we're supposed to be,
right,
really.
right.
So, yeah.
So Jodi, tell us, is there really a mommy brain?
Yeah,
Is
is there really a
like,
mommy
what is
brain?
what
Here
is
we go.
this? What is
Well,
mommy brain, and
yeah,
how do we define it? Because I always hear it kind of in a negative way, like it's a pejorative term of, oh yeah, mommy brain. But it's like, no, like, it's an important transition, I feel, for connecting with your newborn and so forth. But I'd love to hear your take from a neuroscientist.
yeah. So I've thought about this term a lot. I mean, I have my book out titled Mummy Brain in French and English, and Mummy Brain Revisited is my podcast. It's something like I thought about really a lot, this mummy brain idea. Or not idea, but this phrase we use. And
Right.
over the years, I've really wanted us to understand that the brain does amazing things when we transition to parenthood. We have so much more research the past 5 years on the human brain, parental brain, and all these changes that happen that really gear us to care for or to learn how to care for our child. And so I think in many ways we do a disservice to our brains essentially when we think of them as becoming mushy, right?
Right.
So I've really called for this kind of rebranding of mummy brain so that we can acknowledge all the amazing things that take place in our brains during pregnancy and the postpartum period, and not see it as a deficit. And so, but that being said, I think it's important to realize, yeah, like we were just talking about, there's a lot of different factors that can kind of overload our brains. And in many ways, been thinking over the past year or so about how this phrase is also a phrase of camaraderie, or there's something about it sometimes that is needed to start conversations or have a community and connection with other mothers who are struggling with feeling like their brain's not function because they're just overloaded with too many things. So I can see the benefit of having this common experience, but what I'd really love is us to not feel overloaded with motherhood and that our brains are mushy, but also us to be able to give our brain the space it needs, acknowledge the amazing things it is doing, and feel healthier during this time. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's
So
kind of one of those, it's a tricky term because I don't want us to delete it, but I want us to acknowledge that the brain is actually not at a deficit at this time, and we have to,
right.
value it. And yeah.
Right. Right. So it's the mommy brain is something positive. It's something needed. It might not feel positive for the mother experiencing it, but it's, from what I'm understanding, it's almost necessary for our survival, basically. Is it?
So Okay, so this is where, let me clarify a few things.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
one,
Good.
when we
Thank
talk
you.
about mommy brain, people often describe mommy brain, or it's used as a term of my brain isn't working, I'm forgetting things. So, that's
Right.
kind of that
Okay.
portion. And so, in fact, there is research now showing that yes, moms will say, so there's a few components I'll talk about of the memory and motherhood story, and then we'll talk about the brain changes. So, there's this theme of my brain isn't working like it should. I'm forgetting more. Okay. I'm more confused. I have brain fog. This is kind of quite a common theme. And okay, what does the science show? Well, the science actually shows if you ask a mom how she's feeling, very often she'll describe these feelings. But if you bring her into the lab, give her some paper and pencil memory tests, she actually does on average quite well, except for there's two types of memory that seem to show up as having a slight deficit during late pregnancy or the early postpartum period. And that's working memory. So things like a short-term memory, remembering where you parked your car, that might
Huh.
not be working quite as well. And also finding words.
Interesting.
So yeah, so
Interesting.
these
Yeah.
two things can be pulled out. Memory is really multifaceted, and there's needs to be more research on this. But there's something here, but it doesn't seem to be as significant as what mothers are feeling. So
Okay.
this is an interesting component because if you give them a quiet space to do some memory tests, they do quite well. So I was involved in a study when I was in grad school where we had pregnant women in the lab and non-pregnant, non-parents in the lab. And then they did some memory tests in the lab, and then they had to do something from home, a memory test from home, like remember to call in the lab or something like this. And in fact, in the lab, everybody did great, but from home, the pregnant women didn't do as well on the memory test. So this was in 2010. We published this paper, and the conclusions were there's everyday life memory, challenges that occur that we need to investigate further. So, but this to me symbolizes the fact that your brain is functioning when it has the capacity and the environment to function well when you're pregnant or postpartum.
Well, I was
So
going to say, like the quiet space, those were the magic words right there, right?
yeah, there's a quiet space, and you're there to do the task in the lab. You're not
Right.
having to make phone calls. You're not thinking about which car seat you're going to buy or what have you. You don't have a child with you. So there's this component, I think, that really needs to be investigated. And then on top of that, there's been some recent research showing that, in fact, pregnant women are much better at memory for parenting related things. So, and there's no differences in their memory for other things like chairs and what have you, but for parenting related things, they're better.
Hmm.
So I always, when I think of this memory story, I think, okay, there's a few deficits. There's a home environment factor that needs to be investigated, but there's also improvements. But the theme is, and I had someone, she's a researcher on mommy brain, Valerie Miller at Purdue, and she said to me, the brain is doing what it needs to do or can do what it needs to do. It just needs to do it. Right. And
Right.
so I think this comes along with this whole mental load component. How many things are we expected to do as mothers and primary caregivers? And our brain is just then making decisions on what you're going to remember or not. This is a big component, I think, to understanding both the positives, or understanding essentially the transitions that are happening in your brain during this time with regards to memory specifically. So there's this component. The other component, and the other point people will bring up potentially, is that maybe there is also a trade-off. Like these memory little deficits are maybe because your brain's also doing other things and learning other things, right? So that's another piece to the puzzle, a bit of a trade-off. Because do you really need to remember that right now? Because you have to remember to take care of your kid.
When you say that the brain is doing other things, is it, for example, the fact that, like breastfeeding, like lactation does occur in the brain, right? There's a brain center there. So our brain is being taxed by other survival Is
The
that what you're
way
saying, or
what
no?
I look at the way I look at it is actually you have now birthed a child and you need to
Right,
learn how to take care of that kid. There's no
right, right.
switch that turned on. There's no instinct like beep, I know what I'm doing. It's a really rapid learning process. And so this is what your brain is doing, is
Okay.
learning, but this we don't think of. We don't realize that we are quickly and rapidly learning how to figure out what the child needs. Often for us is not on the radar. What is on the radar is I have now forgot my keys for the 500th time. My brain isn't working, right?
Right, right,
So
right, right.
this is where like the narrative needs to switch a bit, I think, to really acknowledge the incredible things that the brain does do when you become a parent in order to keep your child alive and for it to thrive, hopefully, right? And in many
Okay.
cases, your children do thrive. This is kind of where I'd like us to move forward with how we think about our brains, particularly as women, because we often have been on the receiving end of, your brain doesn't work the same way or you're not as smart. And I think that plays into this as well, the
Yeah,
historical
yeah.
perspective. So,
And I think, I mean, I feel like there's more and more conversation about that more recently, just about hormones and female hormones. I mean, I'm an age of where I'm hearing a lot about menopause, right? Of that whole hormonal change. I mean, we menstruate, there's hormones there, we get
yeah,
pregnant, and so it's really about just, female health, how different it is from male health. And I think we've always been focused that health is just, there's just one human body, but no, there isn't. And there's apparently, from your research, there's also a very different brain that we have.
yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I think this is important to acknowledge how much sex and gender impact our brain and biology, but also our social environment and
Hmm.
expectations that are put on us because we can't really delineate the the two. And so it sets us up for different trajectories, definitely. The hormones playing a role as well. Although, when it comes to things like feeling like our brain isn't working across pregnancy and postpartum, or even the brain changes we know about in terms of structure and function, there hasn't been a lot of research showing a clear link between different hormones. And so we still have much to do. But I think obviously it makes sense that all these kind of neurophysiological changes are really important in maintaining our health and maintaining our ability to parent, essentially, or learn how to parent.
Right.
Um, but
Yep.
yeah, sorry, I wanted to touch on actually how the
Yes,
brain
please,
really
please, because I have
changes.
another
Sorry,
question. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
because I've talked about memory, but I also wanted to bring up the fact that your brain does change. There's been a lot of research
Yes.
by many of my friends and colleagues that your brain changes in size across pregnancy, both mothers and
Oh, wow.
fathers. And as well, we know that it changes in function in both mothers or birthing and non-birthing parents in response to your child. So it can be considered as a very plastic time in life for your brain and as an adult. There's a lot going on and a lot of changes, and these are positive changes. It's a good thing. It's setting you up to be able to respond to your child and learn how to parent. So I just wanted to say that as well, that it changes a lot and it's good and it's for a reason.
Right. And so you said birthing parents and non-birthing parents. So whether you're
Yeah.
you're adopting or even maybe fostering a child, your brain is, oh wow, it's fascinating.
It's really
It's
fascinating.
fascinating to me, yeah, because I mean,
Yeah.
I know a bit about, mirror neurons and how important those are for children to learn, and how, we react, and all of that, but I didn't realize that there was actually like a change in size and all of that. I mean, it's amazing how our brain prepares itself, I guess, to be a caregiver.
Yes, exactly. And I think as the research grows, we're seeing these, themes of how, in the birthing and non-birthing parents, of how much the brain is changing. Particularly, I mean, what's fascinating is in function, but also in the structure. And of course, I will say someone, of course, who's pregnant is going to have much greater changes because of
Okay.
all the physiological changes, particularly in terms of structure. We see more significant changes in many different brain areas. But in terms of function, like how the brain is responding to an infant cue, we're seeing that this is really, the research to date is really showing this is experience with the child is important. Not whether you've given birth, not whether you've breastfed or not, it's experience. And so I think this is really important, is that it's not just that you've birthed, that you're set up to be, let's say, quote unquote, the better parent or the primary caregiver. A lot of this has to do with experience
So
with the
can you
child.
elaborate? Yeah, can you elaborate a little bit when you say experience? It's actually the interaction that you have with the child?
Yeah, interaction you
Okay,
have with the
okay,
child.
okay,
Yep, yep. I mean, we
okay.
also know that previous experience prior to birth with kids could be beneficial, of course, in your parenting journey,
Right,
like with
right.
anything. But yeah. So this is interaction with the child. And that being said, I also want to point out that, breastfeeding, although it can be very lovely and meaningful and great for some individuals, it's a real struggle for others. But you don't need to breastfeed for your brain to do all that kind of bonding, oxytocin stuff that it does. I mean, oxytocin exists in dad's brains too. So breastfeeding, oxytocin is released in the brain into the periphery, into the body for breastfeeding and milk ejection, but then it's also released into other areas of the brain for bonding. Let's say we often think of it as a love hormone. It does many other things, but you can think of it as, there's research showing that even looking at your child or skin to skin increases oxytocin. And so you don't need to lactate to get that oxytocin for bonding. So
Right.
I think that this is important to remember as well for those
Yeah.
who don't lactate, or who aren't, who are
Yeah,
adoptive
and
parents or what have
that's
you.
yeah, and thank you for saying that because I think there's also a lot of pressure being put on, women to breastfeed, and like you say, it's not for everyone. Um and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes there's, an emotional thing you don't want to, and that's okay. Like it's hard to feel that pressure on moms when, it doesn't have to be that way. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
just knowing oxytocin is released in your brain without it.
I think
That's
that's
good to
wonderful.
know.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I'm wondering, like, grandparents probably have it too.
Of course.
Yeah,
So there's
because
been one.
there's such a love, with from grandparents sometimes. Like it's a renewed, the whole you were going to say there's been research with
There's been
grandparents?
research
Yeah,
on
yeah.
grandparents. James Rilling at Emory, he has one study looking at grandparents' brain changes. So when I
Oh,
say
wow.
research on parents, I'm saying specific about the brain. There's other research on grandparents, of course, but parents, they looked at the grandparents and their response to their own children and to their grandchildren, and showed that they had more activity in brain areas important for empathy when looking at pictures of their grandchildren, and even
Ah,
more so than looking at pictures of their own adult children. So there is definitely
interesting.
something going on there in grandparents' brains. And this was
Yeah.
in grandmothers specifically. They didn't look at grandfathers, but
Oh,
I think
beautiful.
it's really interesting as well.
Beautiful. Just before we wrap up, I do want to ask you from all your research, is there anything that moms listening or fathers listening that are maybe, expecting or new parents, is there anything that we can do to maybe prevent the negative effects, because you did talk about perinatal mood disorders, and I know that that affects both mothers and fathers, and that
Yeah.
it can be pretty intense. And so, is there anything that we can do to prevent? And I'm asking also as, as a professional birth doula, like, is there anything that I can do to prepare parents so that they don't have to struggle?
Yeah, this is a great question because we do know that a high percentage, 1 in 5 moms and 1 in 10 dads, will struggle with a perinatal mental illness, the most common being depression or anxiety. They can also occur in pregnancy. And so,
Right.
and often the symptoms, anger might be the symptom of depression, for example. So the symptoms might not be what we think either. So often when I think about this, I think, okay, well, I can tell you what I did. Let's use this as an
Okay.
example.
Okay.
I had, of course, an understanding of that this could happen. So one is acknowledge it can happen. It can happen to anybody. It's going to be you will be at higher risk if you've experienced a mental illness before or components of it,
Okay.
symptoms. So I also had experienced pretty bad obsessive thoughts, kind of anxiety issue when I was in graduate school before I had children. And so when I was pregnant, knowing that it becoming a parent can increase the chances of mental health struggles, I wanted to prepare myself. So what I thought, and I always think this is valuable for anyone, is make sure you have your healthcare professionals lined up. Do you like your doctor, your midwife? Do you have a doula? Do you know of maybe a psychologist or at least a mental health support, perinatal mental health support resource that you could use if you need? There's different websites and options for this, right? So prepare yourself just so you can have a go-to if you're starting to struggle. We also know from the research and science that things like going off your medication, your antidepressant medication when you're pregnant is a risk factor in increasing, like it increases the risk of you getting depressed or anxious again. Okay. So there's things like this, lack of social support and isolation. These things are also not healthy and can contribute to that. Often, moving, right? Big life changes can be challenging. Any major kind of stressor in life experienced outside of pregnancy and parenthood also, of course, can be a stressor during this time. So I think part of it is kind of acknowledging that it can happen and know that it can happen and prepare yourself for this. And like you said, I think these kinds of discussions about what will the postpartum look like is really important. So who will your community be made of? Who's going to actually cook? Who's going to clean? Do you want visitors the first week, the
Yeah.
first 2 weeks? What do you want them to do if they come over? Will you feel comfortable with your in-laws in the house? Like, yeah, is your partner going back to work? What was that going to look like for you? Like, these are all, like you said, I think conversations to be had early on, because having a baby is wonderful, but it's also comes with a lot of challenges, and it can really tax the relationship as well. Because
Yes.
there'll be lack of sleep, for example. So if sleep is super important, then how are we going to manage that? Are we going to get a sleep doula? Are we going to do shifts, 4 hours for you, 4 hours for me? All these sorts of things. I threw out a lot of different things, but I guess the theme is don't think it won't happen to you. So then think about what would be helpful for you
Right.
if it does
Right.
happen.
Yeah.
I
No,
think
and
be
yeah.
prepared.
Yeah, I like that because it's really thinking about that plan B. Like I was actually just talking with a client about, what's the ideal birth plan and what would be a plan B if things don't go according to plan. And I think it's the same thing with, perimental mood disorders is, it's not going to affect me, but what if it does? Like, or what if it affects your partner? Like, who do you have somebody that you can talk to and so forth? So planning,
Yeah.
and I think what you're saying too is just the awareness that it can happen to anyone, and that just to, you know, acknowledge that yes, it can, and be prepared. So that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll say one more thing is that
Oops.
often, oh, I just want to highlight that parenting and motherhood is not meant to be a solo journey. So, and just because your partner doesn't respond to your baby in the same way, that doesn't mean that's not good for him or her and baby. So,
Yeah.
this is something, again, if I pull from my personal experience, I was very aware that I wanted to continue aspects of my career, let's say, or I needed to not be the primary carer. For example, I need to share this with my partner. He was very
Okay.
open to this and we agreed, but it was really hard for me. And when my daughter was born, to in fact give her to him for skin to skin, and so, but I made this decision. I left them together for like an hour when we first got back home. I left the house, right? Because I knew that they needed to have their time together to figure stuff out. And so, because motherhood shouldn't be a solo journey, and I also knew that I needed that for my wellness. And so, if you can acknowledge and remember that we're supposed to parent with others, and if that's healthy for everybody, this can also be helpful moving forward.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. Yes, very, very, very important. Thank you. So, Jodi, I always like to wrap up with a more personal question, if I may, on your own parenting. So, you mentioned that you have two children. What is the age of the eldest?
I have a 12-year-old daughter and a 12 and a half year old daughter and nearly 11-year-old son. So
Okay.
I had two under
So,
two at some point.
lucky you. uh, and so, if you were to go back, let's say 13 years ago when you were expecting your firstborn, what wise words would you tell yourself knowing all that you know today?
Yeah, okay, this is a good question. Let me think about it. What would I tell myself? Well, I don't, I'm going to say, and probably stuff I did tell myself is we had faith that we could do it, that biologically we've got this. And I said we. And so that I think, though, that's what I told myself then. We told ourselves, and we continued to tell ourselves is like, yeah, we've got this.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
great. That's great. And it was a team project, so that's good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but I also preface this by saying I think we had a different, perhaps, support system or
And
experience with
and
our
knowledge.
parents and knowledge. My husband is a zoologist. So we had came at it with a different starting point, let's
Mm-hmm.
say. But I really do believe that, we're kind of geared to do this. Sometimes it takes longer for some people than others. Sometimes we need more, bigger villages or whatever, but we're geared to do it.
Mm.
Our
Beautiful.
brains
Thank
have
you.
to learn, so they'll
Yes,
figure it out.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any parting words that you would like to leave our listeners and our viewers with today, Jodi?
I guess parting words would just be to, remember that our brain is really valuable in our transition to parenthood, and to acknowledge that sometimes when we're feeling off or our brain isn't working, I like to think of it as our brain telling us it needs something. And so it needs something so that it can continue what it's doing. And I think we need to value that.
Beautiful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for making the time to come on the art of parenting and sharing your wisdom and your research. I know it's going to be very helpful to a lot of people. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mm.
It's been a pleasure.